Hey everybody, I'm Aaron Simmons. I'm a professor of philosophy at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. I specialize primarily in European philosophy of religion, 19th and 20th century. I do a lot in existentialism and phenomenology, and so it's great to be with you today to talk about these ideas that I think will maybe help us think more effectively about contemporary philosophy of religion and also the way in which French phenomenology might contribute to it. If you would like to be in touch with me and follow the work that I'm doing, please visit my website at jaronsimmons.com and also check out my YouTube channel, Philosophy for Where We Find Ourselves. There I do weekly videos on philosophical ideas and how they apply to our everyday lives. So I'd love to get connected with you and think with you about ideas that matter. Today, I'm going to talk about an idea that I have termed mashup philosophy of religion. Now, what I mean by that is if you're familiar with mashup music, this is where you might have a heavy metal track and a hip hop track, and you bring them together such that each becomes something else, but remaining what it is. The point is, often when we tend to think about philosophy of religion, we talk about analytic philosophy of religion or continental philosophy of religion, as if these are radical dichotomies that never really intersect. And in many ways, sadly, we talk about them as opponents of each other, as at odds with each other. I want to suggest that they are critical resources and critical dialogue partners. So when we think about doing philosophy of religion in this mashup way, the point is not to sell out continental thought in the name of analytic principles or to corrode the analytic approach with continental ideas. It's trying to let both of their discourses sing in their beauty and actually resound relative to what they do well, but recognizing that when they think together, maybe something even more exciting can happen. So in order to do this, let's start off by talking about the way that analytic philosophy of religion has traditionally been understood to function. Now, classically, philosophy of religion in this traditional analytic mode has focused on three questions or topics: the existence and nature of God, right? This is where you get arguments for God's existence. This is where we talk about what predicates are appropriate to the idea of God. And second, we go from the existence and nature of God to the idea that faith and reason is a complicated set of debates that need to be engaged relative to what we might call religious epistemology. So what does faith mean? What's the relation between belief about God and evidence for that belief? Is it possible to have knowledge of religious ideas? And third is, we might say, challenges to the model that is most often deployed in 1 and 2, which is theism. So challenges to theism, especially things like the problem of evil. So if we take these three areas, these three big topics where analytic philosophy of religion traditionally has done most of its work, we can understand that in many ways the debate is framed in terms of two real alternatives. And these three different areas are different ways in which we land in one or the other of these alternatives. And that is theism or atheism. So the existence and nature of God, we would say, well, theism is the view that God exists as a being. Atheism is the view there is no being that is rightly named God. God does not exist. If we talk about this, for example, in terms of the challenges to theism, we might say, well, theism affirms that God is somehow able to be omnipotent and omnibenevolent enough to navigate the realities of evil in the world in some way that leads to a grand theodicy, something that makes sense of evil, even though our basic concepts about God remain in place. Atheism might respond and say, no, the challenge to theism is so substantive in the problem of evil that ultimately we have to abandon the idea of God, at least in the way we've classically understood it, in order to admit the realities of evil that plague our world. So this debate between theism and atheism gets cashed out among very influential, important, and really compelling thinkers. On the one hand, the theistic side, we find people like Alvin Plantinga, Richard Swinburne, Nicholas Wolterstorff, and even others like Linda Zagzebski and Marilyn Stump. On the atheistic side, we find people like Paul Draper or John Schellenberg who are, again, engaging these theist thinkers around the same issues, but coming down by rejecting the claims that they affirm. So if we understand that this general framework of theism and atheism as the two main alternatives about which the big debates in philosophy of religion unfold, we then can start to recognize that there is a broad metaphysical set of assumptions. And those metaphysical sets of assumptions are the things that some continental thinkers want to put under question marks. They want to say, maybe we don't have to assume that theism-atheism dichotomy as the starting point for beginning to think well about philosophy of religion. Now, in order to understand this, we can turn, I think, to the idea of new phenomenology. This is a loose association of some French philosophical thinkers, typically mid-20th century, though some of them are still active and alive today. And they are often referred to as involved in what's called the theological turn of French phenomenology. Now, I reject this idea. I don't think they're doing theology. They are doing properly phenomenological philosophy of religion. But importantly, when they do this sort of work, they are interrogating the underlying assumptions about how it is that we do what we do when we talk about these big concepts and categories in philosophy of religion. When we talk about God, does that necessitate that we are now talking about being, about existence? Or maybe there are different modes and different frames and different concepts by which the idea of God or the idea of religion can be understood. In general, just to give you an idea of who I'm thinking of when I talk about new phenomenology, I'm understanding this as 5 thinkers. Now, this is not meant to be exclusive. It's just a way of trying to get our bearings. I talk about this actually in a book that I wrote with Bruce Ellis Benson called The New Phenomenology, A Philosophical Introduction. There we suggest these 5 thinkers form this general philosophical trajectory that we can now engage and interrogate. These 5 thinkers are Emmanuel Levinas, Michel Henry, Jacques Derrida, Jean-Louis Chrétien, and Jean-Luc Marion. So if this is this frame of new phenomenology, why is it that these new phenomenologists would be resources to interrogate, rethink these metaphysical assumptions about the way being works internal to traditional analytic philosophy of religion, such that we can start mashing up the discourse to let them both be important for each other? I want to suggest that we can see this in the work in particular of the new phenomenologists regarding category 1, the existence and nature of God. So we're going to focus on that one and set aside the faith and reason debates and the challenges to theism and the problem of evil, not because there's not important things to discuss, but so that we can focus in to understand how they might rethink the frames of these debates. Okay. Let's look at Emmanuel Levinas and Jean-Luc Marion as 2 exemplars of this broader new phenomenological trajectory. Emmanuel Levinas suggests that, in fact, we've got to think about a God that is not contaminated by being. Now, you might say, how in the world could we be contaminated by being? Being is the condition of doing anything, of being anything. For Levinas, the problem is, if God is understood internal to the category of being. In other words, we have an ontological umbrella under which God then emerges maybe as the highest or greatest of the things in that umbrella. The problem is that we have an issue with God now not really being transcendent. God ends up being one more example or instance of this thing called being. Now, this idea is not unique to Levinas. In fact, we find the same general worry in Jean-Luc Marion, who says that we've got to think of God without being. Dieu sans l'être. God without being. So God without being, God not contaminated by being, doesn't that just sound an awful lot like atheism? There is no God. Well, not necessarily. And this is where the new phenomenologists really help us rethink some of the terms and the categories and the ideas that we have for too long assumed without interrogating. So what they do is talk about the idea of what is traditionally known as onto-theology, as being an actual problem, not a good idea. Onto-theology is simply the idea that we understand God internal to and primarily in terms of the category of being. So, what's wrong with onto-theology? Well, there are theological and philosophical worries that we've got to attend to. On the one hand, the theological problem is that it seems to reduce God to the concept God, in scare quotes. It makes the idea of that which was the object of worship, the relational dynamic by which we make sense of all that is good, now gets reduced simply to an explanatory principle. God now is no longer the revealed conception of the divine that functions internal to our religious traditions, but God would instead be understood purely as a category for philosophical thought. Now, in doing this, this opens onto the philosophical problem, which is it actually makes it really hard for philosophers to ever talk about God, because all that they would then seem to talk about is a concept of God that now is detached from whatever it is that theology ideally is trying to present as the case. Now, in order to think about how this might work out, let's look at the way that philosophers have traditionally discussed God and named God. God ends up fundamentally being the name we give to a philosophical question that we answer in a particular direction. So we start with some philosophical question, why is there something rather than nothing? And then we end up through, let's say, the ontological argument or the cosmological arguments or the teleological arguments, we end up landing at a spot where we introduce God as the name for the necessary cause by which whatever is. So God really becomes not much more than the explanatory principle causa sui, the self-cause. Alternatively, what if we think about God as the response to the question of how do we understand perfection or a qualitative concern about our existence? Well, then God becomes the highest good, the sunum bonum, right? So in all of these ways, God becomes what John Sanders refers to as the the ultimate metaphysical principle deployed in an explanatory capacity to respond to the questions that philosophers have long asked. Now, you might say, well, we need umps. We couldn't play baseball without them. But the problem here is that in making God the God becomes not much more than, again, this philosophical gesture. The attempt to make sense of God according to philosophical categories makes it look an awful lot like philosophy's never really talking about God, but it's only ever talking about these explanatory metaphysical concerns and the need to give some sort of adequate response to them. But that's a long way, says Martin Heidegger, from the idea of a God before whom we can dance and to whom we worship and we offer praise. These things that are fairly ubiquitous in lots of traditional religious traditions, though of course not all, make pause in our attempt to think that philosophy really understands God well when it thinks of God according to being, according to existence. Instead, as Marion and the new phenomenologists point out, we risk idolatry. Now, importantly here, idolatry doesn't have to assume that one is theologically committed. Idolatry could just be the idea that you are now reflecting on, committed to, embracing of something that is a pale imitation of what you're really trying to target. We've missed God theologically, and we've missed God philosophically. Instead now, the only thing that is graspable according to categories that are inappropriate overlays on something that really is deeper than the philosophical impulse to answer questions ontologically. Now, that's a mouthful, and I understand that this can get a little bit tricky. But let's begin to think about how this challenge to onto-theology might invite a rethinking of this framework of theism and atheism as a dichotomy beginning at the heart of our philosophical responses to religious questions. If we think that atheism and theism are not the only options in town, that in fact there's a different way to approach it, then we can begin to recognize that this is just good phenomenology. Phenomenology at its heart, according to Edmund Husserl and then those working in his legacy like the new phenomenologists, they understand that whenever we talk about something that gives itself to our consciousness, that appears, that shows itself, we only understand that object as given relative to a horizon of intelligibility. It's only in relation to some sort of meaning context that something appears as what we take it to be. Well, now apply that concern, this idea of horizons, apply that to religious phenomena, and especially this idea of God. What would be the conditions under which something like God could show up as God? Well, the problem is if our horizon is philosophical, ontological, metaphysical structures, then it seems like God could only ever show up as causa sui, the great designer, the sunum bonum. God could only ever be revealed as that which would now make it difficult to let God show God's self as God's self, but instead God would only be revealed as a philosophical response. Now, this raises a different question. The phenomenologists, like Derrida and Marion, really disagree on sort of, is it even possible then to talk about religious phenomena? Because it seems like that if anything gives itself as an object, according to some horizon, well, religious phenomena are those which would somehow necessarily be horizonless. That religion functions as its own meaning-making context. And it's got to show up that way. Well, Derrida suggests this doesn't make any sense because it would be unintelligible. So a God not contaminated by being, in order to get around onto theology, risks just being a God who doesn't show up. Well, a God who doesn't show up might, as an analytic thinker like John Schellenberg suggests, a God who doesn't show up might be a God who is so hidden that we then conclude atheism is the best option. So there is a really fine line here of thinking carefully as phenomenologists and yet trying to avoid falling back into the dichotomy with which we started. Now, how then can we move forward? I want to suggest that what we see in new phenomenology is actually a compelling invitation not to get log-jammed in the atheism-theism debate, but instead to realize if we're gonna go behind onto theology and open ourselves up to the possible givenness of that which, as given religiously, might outstrip our abilities to make sense of it internal to our philosophical categories, that challenge is one that actually aligns with a very particular theological tradition itself. And here again, we've got philosophy and theology, resources for each other without collapsing them into each other. And this tradition is what is known as Apophaticism. Apophaticism is the idea that we basically engage God relative to negation, or what God is not, rather than understanding God according to positive articulations or predicates that can be affirmed. Now, why might this be a resource? Well, the new phenomenologists, like the apophatic mystical theologians of old, understand that God, if God is not bound and contaminated by being, if God is without being in some sense, as Marion suggests, that God would have to be transcendent of the very categories by which we make sense of God. So we could only ever say, well, God is beyond comprehension. God is beyond understanding. God is beyond any notion of causation by which we understand the world. God would be more than our conceptions of ontology. This apophatic awareness, I think, runs throughout the new phenomenological philosophical tradition and is in many ways a kind of corrective to what I take to be a cataphatic or positive theological overstep that often occurs in analytic philosophy of religion. Now, not across the board, but as a general tendency, whether theist or atheist, there tends to be a overconfidence relative to how we can talk about God according to these categories. Whereas the apophatic, more continental, more phenomenological approach reminds us that we've got to always push pause so that we don't fall into that idolatry, whether theological or philosophical. However, and this is important, mashup philosophy of religion, not just let's go do continental work, the analytic cataphatic response is also a kind of corrective to the idea of just giving into a rampant vacuity, a sort of nebulous whatever that would often threaten the continental approach, where now we're not really seemingly talking about God anymore. We're talking about things like impossible phenomena, or what Heidegger refers to as the phenomenology of the unapparent. But that doesn't sound a lot like God that I hear about in churches or synagogues or mosques. So we've got to remember that the cataphatic excess that the continental approach challenges also stands as a cataphatic corrective to the apophatic excess that can itself become a kind of, we might say, linguistic idolatry, where now we're really not so much talking about God anymore, but we're talking about our own opacity and our philosophical sophistication as this big awareness that we could never say anything positive about the divine. We've got to avoid both excesses. Now, how do we do this? I suggest that one of the really cool things about new phenomenology, and in particular Levinas and Marion, who we are sort of using as our case studies, is they all stand on a spectrum relative to not understanding God as being, but God as personal. So this spectrum of God as personal becomes the more urgent question, or the better frame than God as being, where the question is either in or out, theism, atheism. And on this spectrum, we actually see the new phenomenologists kind of divide along it. On the one side, the more atheistic side of the spectrum of God as personal, we find Levinas. And this is, of course, something that shouldn't surprise us. When Levinas says that God is contaminated by being, we've got to rethink God outside of that contamination. He also then describes the goal of thinking a God transcendent to the point of absence. Transcendent to the point of absence. Now, again, that sounds an awful lot like God would not only not be personal, but God may not even exist in any sense that would make sense relative to our conversation, relative to our discourse. On the other end, we have someone like Jean-Luc Marion, who says God without being is what we're trying to articulate, but he also then says in the preface, the revised preface to God without being, he says, but this doesn't mean God's not at least a being. God being a being ends up being all-containing. It ends up contaminating, as Levinas says. But what if we think of being as the kind of minimal threshold? It's almost an uninteresting point about the divine. Then God is now better understood, says Marion, not as an existing being, where the fundamental question of philosophy of religion is God a thing? Does God exist? But instead, we begin to relate to God as more understood along the lines of charity or love. What would it look like to understand God as love rather than God as existing necessary being? That shift for Marion is a shift that doesn't deny existence as part of how we make sense of God, but it doesn't let that be the fundamental category, the framework by which we make sense of all of these complicated questions that emerge because of the phenomenological register in which we are engaging. Now, in the midst of that spectrum, Levinas on one side, Marion on the other, I think we get a sort of range of options, a range of views. Over there with Levinas, maybe even further out than Levinas, we find Derrida, who says famously that he rightly passes as an atheist. Now notice that framework. He's not saying I am an atheist as if that were the option. But instead, he rightly passes as one because he's saying, yeah, the views I hold, the way I make sense of God, of the divine, it looks more like atheism than any other option that is currently in play. I rightly pass as that. That's a good way to make sense of me, but I don't want to be simply identified that way and then eliminate the phenomenological and existential complexity that we've now been opening up. So Derrida, Levinas, and then moving along we find Michel Henry and Jean-Louis Chrétien, and then we move all the way to Marion. Now, thinking about the spectrum between the God transcendent to the point of absence and God as at least a being, we can now begin to understand that new options emerge. So for Marion, now idolatry is the worry, which we've already discussed, but iconography, the idea of God as icon, emerges as a positive option. God now draws us toward God's self rather than God being simply this category as a product of our discourse. Now this, remember, creates some phenomenological issues. Does that givenness of God that would draw us towards God's self be something that in fact functions in any way we could understand? How is it that God is given without being given according to those horizons by which we then seem to reduce back to these ontological structures? Well, what Marion offers is actually a really cool idea of an embodied relationality. And he says that the way we relate to other persons is through embodied access, right? We shake hands, we greet, we say hello, we kiss. These modes of interaction don't start with, does the other person exist? They start with, existence again is the least interesting. What matters is, what will it look like to stand in relation, to know that person in a way that allows our bodies to be invested in each other in ways that then draw us into deeper love, deeper charity. And he thinks that this is what's possible with God according to an idea that he terms counter-intentionality. So traditionally, we've understood intentionality as consciousness is always conscious of something, according to a horizon. But now, he says, maybe God shows up or God is revealed such that we become conscious of ourselves as looked at, as loved by God. And he says that this happens in saturated phenomenal engagements. For example, in the Eucharist for the Catholic tradition, taking the bread and the wine as the blood and body of Christ becomes a moment where we realize, it's only bread and wine. It's only ever going to be that according to a philosophical, phenomenological mode of looking. But what would it look like to take myself up as receiving the blood and body of Christ? Now, it's not that I see it as something, it's that I am seen differently because of it having a new possible way of presenting. Now, that idea of receiving ourselves as loved by God, rather than God simply being looked at by us, or God as the product of our apologetic arguments, is something that I really do think is a deeper domain that opens up classical debates in really compelling ways, mashing up analytic and continental in a way that doesn't eliminate one or the other, but brings them both to a higher domain, a higher register where they can actually signal with more clarity. This general structure that we've now seen in Marion is actually something we can also find in Levinas, but again, with a different spectrum of how he understands God as personal. So for Levinas, like Derrida, God is less personal than for someone like Marion. We don't see God as first lover. We instead understand God as this name given to the depth dimension that shows up in the face of the other. Now, this makes sense for Levinas because, of course, for Levinas, ethics is first philosophy, which is replacing the ontological priority that had structured so much of the traditional discourse, the question of being. So if ethics is deeper, responsibility is deeper than being, than existence, then it makes sense that God would then be given internal to that ethical, that responsible framework. So for Marion, we've got love and charity as these deeper domains. For Levinas, we have ethics. And what this does is, again, doesn't make atheism true, but it instead invites a way of making sense of God as less personally available as a unique or discrete person, and instead God becomes personally engaged, but insofar as we are engaged with other persons. And this is where the transcendent to the point of absence starts to resound. God does not disappear, but shows up precisely insofar as we are not now talking about God, but caring about the other person. So in these different options, one that is less personalist, one that is more personalist, we still find a way of thinking robustly about God, of making sense of how religious life, religious existence could be undertaken in compelling ways, without falling back into the simple dichotomy of theism and atheism. Those are not unimportant debates, but they don't have to be the only things that we can say and the only framework by which we make sense of what we do as philosophers of religion. So I want to suggest that this is where we get some interesting alternatives of maybe ways of thinking about what we're up to. Traditionally, there has been this idea of religion. And that's the object of what philosophers are interested in inquiring into and talking about. Derrida shows up and says, no, what we've got to think about is religion without religion. A way of making sense of religion that doesn't fall back into those categories, that doesn't give back into the sort of radical determinacy that invites the cataphatic excess. Well, I suggest, along with some other thinkers, such as Jeff Hansen and Drew Dalton and Stephen Minister and Bruce Benson, we all suggested in a book called Religion with Religion, that this idea of religion as cataphatic excess is problematic in light of all of the onto-theological worries we've discussed, but religion without religion can also go too far toward the apophatic excess. And this is why, personally, I find the non-personalist spectral side of the new phenomenological category and the new phenomenological perspectives to be less compelling than the more personalist side. That's not to say that there are better arguments for it. It's just that I think it gets us different types of outcomes, different types of ways of making sense of our lived existence. So I tend to identify more with the idea of the personalism that we see in Marion and Chrétien, more so than the apersonalism in Derrida and Levinas. But the point is, what's really cool, we don't have to have some sort of final decision here for doing philosophy of religion. Instead, religion with religion is an idea that lets us realize we have to think in light of the critique of onto-theology. We have to, as Merold Westphal suggests, overcome onto-theology in order to invite a more appropriately robust and engaged and personally embodied way of being religious. This is why, in fact, someone like Gianni Vattimo suggests that it's only because of the death of God that we can really be religious again. So if we think of religion as the traditional cataphatic excess, religion without religion as the possible apophatic excess, religion with religion might, I suggest, become this alternative that lets us see the cataphatic determinacy as necessary for understanding the lived realities of people who identify as religious, that those have to be taken seriously and they might even be true. But similarly, we've got to recognize that those lived realities are often framed according to the philosophical assumptions that close down real openness to God revealing God's self in different ways. Religion with religion leaves both on the table, allows theism and atheism to be options that we all individually can rightly pass as, but not in absolute ways, but in ways that require our theism to be haunted by atheism, and our atheism to always be checked by theistic possibilities. That's what I tend to refer to as this idea of postmodern cataphaticism. Postmodern cataphaticism would be the awareness of the critique of cataphatic theology occurring in the continental tradition, but also being aware that to set aside the determinate possibility of a specific religious tradition actually getting some things right about God, about the divine, and about who we are in relation to God, we can't foreclose that possibility. We can't set it off the table. So becoming someone who says religion with religion doesn't mean that we are religious. It means that we are open to these possibilities, moving in more complicated and nuanced and, I think, lived ways, invites a postmodern cataphatic project that then makes it possible for us to engage the Flanagas and the Swinburnes, and yet do so by understanding maybe some of the heft and weight of the Draper and Schellenberg challenges, without thinking that that then is all that one can say. There's more to what we do as lived, embodied beings, thinking about the world, interrogating ourselves as we ask questions about God, faith, evil, and other religious issues. When we interrogate ourselves, we let ourselves be interrogated by these questions. I think this opens us up not to positive theology, though some might go in that direction. This doesn't yield a erasure of philosophy in the name of theology. It doesn't, as Dominique Janicot suggests, smuggle in revealed theology in the back door of phenomenology. What this does is actually makes us really good phenomenological philosophers. Being really good at phenomenology is not to put off the table certain options, but to be open to revelation in its mode of givenness. And one of those modes, as Nietzsche might say, as Sartre might say, is that being faithful is part of what it looks like to become an atheist. But yet another one of those possible modes might be the Kierkegaardian task of being faithful by trying to become a Christian, or to become a Muslim, or to become some other tradition of religion that we have culturally understood. So, in conclusion, where does this all land us? What is the result of all of this very complicated work? Well, I think the big point is philosophy of religion should not be understood as the exclusive property of one or the other methodologies that have traditionally marked its discourse. We need to think not only of ourselves as metal fans or hip-hop fans, but as metal fans who also like hip-hop, and hip-hop fans who also really enjoy a track by Slayer. Being able to mash up these discourses does not erase them. It does not make them less what they are, but it does make them maybe more compellingly visible as why they mattered in the first place. And as any political philosopher will tell you, it's really important that we open ourselves up for critique. And in doing that, the critical options are not just theism and atheism. They're not just ontological alternatives. They are also alternatives to our ontological assumptions. That's what new phenomenology provides. And in providing it, it makes us not land somewhere positively in terms of religion, but it might open us up to the possibilities that landing somewhere and landing somewhere else actually are robustly encouraged by phenomenological work. Anyway, I hope this is helpful as we all continue to think together about how to do philosophy of religion in spaces where we need to start by realizing we are outstripped by the very thing we're trying to think through. It's more than any one person or one discourse or one set of assumptions could ever possibly really make sense of in its own language. But maybe by learning the languages of others, by seeing their questions, we can begin to unpack what it is that is going on in the discourse that we deploy. Thank you again. Please check out jaronsimmons.com. Be in touch with me. I'd love to think with you about these important ideas. And also check out the YouTube channel, Philosophy Where We Find Ourselves, because that's where I try to bring these really difficult notions and bring them to bear on our daily practice, our daily lives. Because philosophy, if it is anything, has to be about thinking well in order to live well. I wish you well. Take care.